Good evening. So we're going to have 10 videos just in time for my vacation. But not 10 chapters read. How bad is that? We're just terrible. Terrible, lazy people. Alright. I had some thoughts. Because, well, the first thing I wanted to mention is that, did anybody notice the condition trigger that I elicited in you, some of you, the other day? It was a conditioning, right? When I said I got my pencil and I'll give me something to write on, a certain percentage of my audience started singing Hot for Teacher. So diabolically, I made you say you were hot for me. But it's just to bring out an example of how susceptible, what do they call that, neuroplasticity? And what would we call that? What do you think that the psychiatrists would call that? You know, it's a conditioned stimulus, but yet it's not for behavior, it's just from the tape in your head. So what would we call that? Latent conditioning, maybe? You know, could be. I don't know. I wonder if they'll give that a definition for us. And I also wanted to bring out a point to harken back to the conversation of how do we operate changing of human behavior, manipulating human behavior, without it being manipulating human behavior according to our desire that you think or do a certain way. And for this argument, I happened upon a very, very perfect human example. And this example was of a 5-year-old child sharing a stick with a younger or equal of age child, it doesn't matter, and they did not want to share. And at the point where he was told he must, he instead decided to try to break the toy, because if he couldn't have it, he wasn't going to let somebody else have it. It's quite a human impulse that we have, isn't it? Now, if you want to say everybody's entitled to their personality, right? Should I say let him alone with it? It's just the way he is. He just always wants to take away, make sure that you don't get what he got, because that's just the way he is, and we should let him be that way because of positive human regard? No. Do you think this child... See, the reason why I'm talking about his human misbehavior is that his parent did not step in and actually teach a moral lesson to this child, that behavior is not decent. So, by not disciplining the child, that he should definitely not respond to the "I'll break it because you can't have it" mentality, that he should redirect his energy, or that he should look somewhere else. Fairness, compassion, emotional regulation, not having vengeance, not being mean. There's lots of ways you can handle that situation. What we're dealing with is the impulse that, if it is not corrected and redirected and told a correct way to do it, it becomes habit. It becomes reinforced. It becomes accepted. It becomes condoned, rationalized. Eventually, You've got a grown-up asshole who, that's just the fact of it. But how are you going to know when your kid has that kind of motive? I mean, how could you tell? Learn. You watch your kid. We can't do that. We have this lifestyle in this society. Well, then it's going to be harder. Until we realize that raising humans is a pretty damned important thing. So let's say, okay, so let's go back, let's think about it. Think about it for a few minutes. You don't teach this child that it's not okay. How do you inflict a corrective discipline? Well, ridicule it, right? Ridicule it. First one on the list. Don't you think we should ridicule behaviors that we don't want put on us? He broke the toy. Now the kid gets to suffer. Now we should make fun of him. Well, did it feel good to hurt the other person? It's real simple. It sounds crazy, but where are we spending our energy? Where do we put our energy of ridicule? Oh, you've got freckles and no teeth. You want to make me feel bad for that? Why not redirect it to human bad behavior? Why is that so hard? Why is that so hard? Because we're selfish? Yeah. Buddha said so. Ego, greed, and ignorance. I think that's all I had to say about human bad behavior today, or so far. So, seven minutes wasted. That was just the beginning. Experiments were then carried out to establish just how long an interval between the giving of a conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus would still lead to a conditioned response when the conditioned stimulus was given alone. How long did the learned response of salivating to a tuning fork carry on occurring if, after a while, no food ever followed the hearing of the sound? Did the conditioned stimulus have to be something so blatant as the sound of a tuning fork, or could it be something considerably more subtle? It was soon discovered, for instance, that time was as sure a conditioner as sound or the sight of an object. If food was presented at regular intervals and no tuning fork struck, the dogs learned to associate the length of time that passed with the intermittent arrival of food. They would start to salivate just before it was due. That is a phenomenon familiar in everyday life. Someone who is used to having breakfast at 8, lunch at 12, tea and biscuits at 4, and dinner at 7:30 in the evening will feel hungry as those times approach because his body is conditioned to receive food on cue. Therefore, gastric juices start churning in readiness as the right time approaches. Back to the tuning fork for a moment. Pavlov, having conditioned his dogs to salivate to the tone, wanted to know how permanent that response would be if food, which was the real reason for salivating to a tone, ceased to follow the tone ever again. He found, as might be expected, because you didn't do think work, that as time went on and the dogs heard a tone but received no food shortly thereafter, they salivated less and less to the sound of the tuning fork and finally ceased to do that at all when they heard it. The association between tuning forks and food had been extinguished. However, occasionally, a while after the sound had ceased to produce any salivation, out of the blue, a dog would suddenly salivate on hearing it. This Pavlov called spontaneous recovery, and surmised that it meant that the learned response had been suppressed rather than forgotten. He was a little wrong. But as again no food would appear, the conditioned response would once again be suppressed or even become truly forgotten. Another couple findings from Pavlov's laboratory are worth studying before going on to see how conditioned responses of their various kinds can play a role, often unconscious, in ordinary human behavior, and how our knowledge of conditioned responses can be used to shape behavior, which is what I'm on about. I'm not trying to be on about much, but looking. There's no harm in looking. I'm not feeling as manic today. I'm riding my waves. Pavlov found that a dog which was conditioned to salivate on hearing a particular tone struck by the tuning fork also usually responded by salivating when it heard a tone that was either higher or lower than the original one it had learned by. Pavlov called this generalization. Again, it is a phenomenon familiar in life. A woman who is attacked by a man when walking alone at night down a street may well come to fear any man who looms into view on any subsequent occasion when she is alone at night in the street. But Pavlov's dogs also showed the power to discriminate. A tone that was considerably higher or considerably lower than the original tone they had paired with food elicited far less salivation than one that was closer. One of Pavlov's students found that discrimination could itself be conditioned. Using cards that showed a circle followed by food as a conditioned stimulus to trigger salivation, she found that the dogs would also salivate if she showed them cards with an ellipse. In other words, generalization occurred. She then set about teaching them to distinguish between circle and an ellipse by giving them food only after she had shown a circle, but not after she had shown an ellipse. Once the dogs had caught on and only salivated to the circle, she proceeded to test how far their discriminative powers could go. She started showing them cards with ellipses that looked more and more like circles, until finally the dogs failed to discriminate between them at all. What was most interesting, however, was what happened to the dogs while they were undergoing this experience. One dog, Pavlov describes, started wriggling about in its experimental stand, tried to bite off the apparatus tubes, and then, when taken out, began to bark violently and generally display all symptoms of neurosis. Later testing showed that it could no longer discriminate between even a simple circle and ellipse. Because you gave it collapse A of the worst kind. Took away his entire sense of meaning and called it symptoms of neurosis. What had happened was that the stress of trying to discriminate between food and non-food signals, the circle and the ellipse, was too much for the dog. It was from there that Pavlov went on to study the neurosis that could be induced by giving a dog conflicting signals, which threw it into confusion. These findings were outlined in Chapter 2. Pavlov's interest was to see how stress reactions affected conditioned learning. Oh, there's a thing about the Milgram experiment that I was thinking of. About the Milgram experiment. Told it was the study of how punishment affects learning is suspicious, because what they were testing, as far as you're the man on the street and you believe it is a test of a valid nature, what they would be really testing is not the effects of punishment on learning, but the effects of punishment on memorization. Different animal. I don't know if that matters. I'm sure it doesn't matter, but here we have Pavlov trying to see if he could teach things that way. Or try to get them to let go of things with the stress way. But it is relevant here to consider the bad guys' tactics of switching from kindness to cruelty, or by giving or withholding of rewards. They were inducing confusion and stress in prisoners by preventing them from learning to adapt to expected behavior. As we shall see, conditioning, which is a vital and natural form of learning that helps us function in our environment, can become utterly disabling when it is maladaptive. I have a big note written here. What does it say? In a camp, expect this, mock it, believe, know it is God, emotions. Huh. It says, beware to remember things to cope in some place not real or normal. Resolution, liberation, de-intensity, and complacency, I guess, will change, revolt, be freed, die, or this is to something. Ah, there are my notes that went into the writing of my statement. And so this is what inspired my writing. As we shall see, conditioning, which is a vital and natural form of learning that helps us function in our environment, can become utterly disabling when it is maladaptive. The conditioning of fear and anxiety, for instance, can be both adaptive and maladaptive. In other words, useful or disabling. A child who touches a boiling kettle and gets burned will learn not to touch boiling kettles again. A child who, having been burnt by a burning kettle, generalizes its fears to all kettles, even when cold, has a learned response that ceases to be useful. American psychologist John Watson is famous for his experiments in conditioning fear. He was an ardent enthusiast of Pavlov's ideas and considered the father of behaviorism because he maintained that all behavior, however complicated, is the result of learned responses to different stimuli. Oh, and the kid who wanted to be cruel because he was just being a selfish asshole, that kid needed to be spanked for that. I'm not against spanking, but I am against ignorantly hitting somebody. And I think that every time you hit somebody, there has to be meaning. There has to be a meaning and a proper connection so that you don't have to hit them at all, or hit them long, or hit them much. It doesn't even have to hurt if it's all delivered with proper meaning. You don't get to tell other person that they can't have it because you can't have it. You don't get to act like that in a society. And the more we let you act like that in society, the more people are going to get abused over and over and over again. It's a stinking cycle. And we can fix it individually by giving a damn. But I'm talking to nobody, because we're never going to give a damn. Only individually can we do it. And if you do it, you have to individually accept the fact that Hopefully we don't catch on. 20 minutes. You know what we're going to do? Probably going to take a break from this and do a kid's book before I continue this. The 10 chapters, 12 chapter playlist block is enough. Now I want to change gears and read a story. Okay. He thought, if one could find exactly which stimuli enticed or elicited which response, all the complexities of human behavior would be unraveled, without any need to get bogged down in immeasurables like ideas and emotions. In an experiment to show that emotions are only the result of simple conditioning, he set about to instill in a little boy called Albert a fear of white rats. Having given Albert an appealing white lab rat to play with, which the child liked, Watson then started hitting a steel bar with a hammer every time Albert touched the rat. Startled by the noise, Albert soon learned to associate white rats with terrifying sudden sounds and developed a fear of the rat. The indefatigable Watson then proceeded to prove that Albert's fear had generalized to white furry objects, as he was just as frightened by the sight of a white fur coat and even Santa Claus's whiskers. Fear, however, is not a reflex action. It is a protective response that gets the body ready to react to a frightening or threatening situation. While Watson could show that it was just as easy to condition such an emotional response, it was just as easy to condition such emotional responses as it was to condition reflex actions such as salivatation. He found that emotional responses were not anywhere near as easy to extinguish. Ceasing to use the hammer, and even verbal reassurances to Albert that the rat was harmless, did nothing to reduce the boy's fear. Conditioning that is maladaptive to our environment is not only produced by experiments in laboratories with hypotheses to prove. Conditioning that is maladapted to our environment is not only produced by experiments in laboratories with hypotheses to prove. Our experiences throughout life affect the way we adapt to all similar and not so similar situations. A man whose first 2 girlfriends were much more intelligent than he, and who therefore made him feel uncomfortable, inadequate, and anxious when he was with them, may learn to avoid 2 intelligent women in the future. Or he may generalize his fear and start feeling anxious in the presence of all women, whether emotionally involved with them or not. The later response is patently maladaptive. Watson thought that classical conditioning was the be-all and end-all of human behavior. He was wrong in that. Certainly, emotional responses to environmental stress can be affected by many factors other than the particular stress itself. A psychologist called Liddell from Cornell University spent 30 years studying experimental neurosis, which had been induced in the dogs who couldn't discriminate between eclipses and circles. In one experiment in the 1950s, he exposed a mother sheep and her twin lambs to inescapable electric shocks. The mother and 1 lamb were in one room, and the twin lamb in another on its own. The twin lambs had electrodes attached to them, and every so often as they roamed about their rooms, the lights dimmed for 10 seconds, and then the lambs received a brief shock. Liddell found that 2 lambs responded in different ways. As the lone lamb became conditioned to the fact that when the lights dimmed, it would receive a shock, it started to act neurotically and ended up cowering in a corner. The other lamb continued wandering around the room regardless of impending shocks. It seemed that the mother's presence had a stabilizing effect on that lamb, which kept it relaxed and able to weather unpleasant shocks without becoming neurotic. One might generalize from this to the different effects that certain alarming experiences have on children who come from stable homes and children who live in an insecure home environment. One might generalize from this to the different effects of certain houses. That is perhaps why psychiatrists are skeptical of the behavioral approach to curing neurotic problems. The behavioralist believes that by teaching new responses, a neurotic pattern may be made to disappear. The psychoanalyst thinks that the cause of the neurosis has to be extricated from the unconscious first before it can be eliminated. Behavior therapy relies on the laws of conditioning, but before looking at behavior therapy in operation, it is necessary to discuss a second type of conditioning called operant conditioning, the potential of which was explored by American psychologist B.F. Skinner. Let's stop it right here and probably come back to that after my vacation and after book 2 of The Adventures of the Great Brain. Goodbye.